In previous levels, we've been looking at economic growth. And one of the primary ways in Canada we get sustainable economic growth is by increasing the quantity and quality of our labor. Well, let's continue that discussion by looking more at the quantity of labor, by looking at those who are in the labor force and those who are employed versus those who are unemployed. So we need to know some key terms. The first is working age population. You are considered to be working age population within Canada if you are over 15 and you are not in the armed forces or living on an Aboriginal reserve. The reason that we exclude armed forces and Aboriginal reserves is because we want to be able to do a comparison across countries, and some countries have conscription or required service of all of their adult population in the armed forces, and so we can't really compare across countries if some countries have that and others don't. The others we were looking at contribution to producing goods and services in our economy, and we don't, if we're comparing year to year and we decided to have conscription one year and not another, we don't want that to bias the numbers as we compare what's happening with labor in our country. So we exclude that entirely. When it comes to residents of Aboriginal reserves, we don't include that in the working age population and in our unemployment rates or any of that, because within Canada, those who live on an Aboriginal reserve are considered to kind of live in their own country within a country. So your band, your tribe, your Aboriginal group, they would basically be the ones looking after the economy within that reserve or territory. And so it's seen as essentially a separate entity from the rest of the country. So in Canada, when we look at working age population and we look at labor force participation and unemployment, we don't include those in Aboriginal reserves. Now we want to focus in on the labor force. So within the working age population, there are people who have a job or are looking for work. If you have a job, part-time, full-time, or you are looking for work, you are part of the labor force. So then our labor force participation rate is the percentage that are in the labor force out of that working age population. So it's important to understand what we mean by being in the labor force. So what does it mean to be in the labor force in Canada? If you have a job, you are gainfully employed, you are part of the labor force. If you have a job, but you're not currently working because you're on a leave of absence for illness, you're on vacation, or because your union is on strike, you are still considered to be part of the labor force. You're still considered to be employed. If you've been laid off within the last 26 weeks, but you're expected to be called back, then you are still considered to be employed and part of the labor force. Now we see a lot of this in oil, for example, when there is a lot of downtime, when a lot of the oil companies are doing maintenance, they may temporarily lay people off and then bring them back later. And so here that allows us, in terms of measuring, to measure those people as part of the labor force and employed. If you are not employed, but you're starting a job in the next 30 days, you are considered to be part of the labor force. Essentially, we consider you to already be employed, have a job. Now, if we compare the definition of the labor force in Canada versus the US has a slightly different definition of being in the labor force. So let's suppose you're about to graduate from college and you've lined up a job. Now, this job is more than 30 days out. So if it's more than 30 days out in Canada, you are not considered to be looking for work because you're going to school full time, and you're not considered to be part of the labor force since that job is further out. But in the US, if it's more than 30 days out, but you've already lined up a job for after graduation, you are then considered part of the labor force and technically already employed. There's also a difference in terms of those who are not employed, but who are looking for work. The difference between the US and Canada is whether they are seeking or actively seeking work. So how much steps, or what do you have to do to prove that you're looking for work? Is it only that you have to check wanted ads, send in resumes, or is it that you are going to interviews, beating on doors, those kinds of things? So there's a difference in the definition between the U.S. and Canada in terms of what it means to be looking for work. Well, this has an impact, this difference in definition between Canada and the U.S. And this difference in definition makes the Canadian unemployment rate 1% higher than the U.S. unemployment rate. So if we want to actually compare the Canadian unemployment rate and the U.S. unemployment rate, we actually have to do an adjustment. So for example, let's take a look at the U.S. and Canadian unemployment rates. So if we go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we can see here the unemployment rate for the U.S. in September 2017 is 4.2%. Okay, let's compare that to what it is in Canada. So unemployment rate in Canada is 6.2%. So that was 6.2% and 4.2%. So if we want to compare the two of them, it was 6.2 for Canada, and that was 4.2 for the US. So if we look directly at those, it seems like Canada is doing much worse because that's 2% difference in the unemployment rate. But because of the differences in our definitions of looking for work and being in the labor force, if you really want to compare Canada and the US, you actually have to reduce the Canadian unemployment rate by 1% to compare them. And so really, our unemployment rate of 6.2% is the equivalent of a US 5.2%. And so you can see then there's less of a difference between them. So let's look at calculating the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. So right now, September 2017, the population of Canada is 37.7 million people. Of those 37.7 million people, 29.98 of them are working age population. So the rest, this portion that we see here, those are people who are under 15, living on an Aboriginal reserve or in the armed forces. Of the working age population, about 29.98 million, in the labor force, we have 19.668. So who is this group? Well, this group is old enough to work, okay, but they're not working or looking for work. So to be in the labor force, you must be looking for work or working. Those who are working age population who are not part of the labor force would include stay-at-home moms and dads, people who inherited a bunch of money so they don't have to work. If you're a full-time student, so you're not working or looking for work, you're also here in the working age population, not part of the labor force. Of the people who are in the labor force, you are either employed or you are unemployed. And so we want to figure out the labor force participation rate, so what percentage of people who are working age have a job or are looking, and then we want to find the unemployment rate, that is what percentage of the labor force, so people who have jobs and those who are looking for jobs, what percentage of them can't find the jobs. So we need to do some calculations here. All right, let's find the labor force participation rate. And the formula for finding the labor force participation rate is the number in the labor force divided by the working age population times 100. That'll give us a percentage, and so that we don't have to deal with decimals, that's why the times 100. So number in the labor force is our 19,668,100. And we divide that by the working age population, 29,981,800, and we're going to multiply that times 100. So we do that calculation, 19,668,100 divided by 29,981,800. Then we multiply the whole thing times 100, and we find the labor force participation rate is 65.6%. So of those who could work, 65.6% are either looking for work or working. So that remaining percentage, okay, the remaining essentially 35% of our working age population are stay-at-home parents, people who are independently wealthy, don't have to work, or are full-time students. Now let's find the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate, the formula for that is the number of unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. Now in this example that you see here, we didn't give you the number who are unemployed, but you can find it because the labor force is made up of those who are either working or looking for work. So if we take that 19,668,100 and we subtract those who have jobs, 18,454,100, you can find the number who are unemployed. And so when we do that, 19,668,100 minus 18,454,100, we get 1,214,000. So then the unemployment rate is the number of unemployed, 1,214,000, divided by the size of the labor force, 19,668,100. And we multiply times 100 because, again, we want to turn it into a percentage. We don't want to have to deal with a bunch of decimals. So let's do 1214 and 3 zeros divided by 19,668,100. And we multiply the whole thing times 100. And we do that calculation, we get essentially 6.17% is our unemployment rate. Now let's go and compare this to what we find on the Statistics Canada website. So if we go into the Statistics Canada website, notice that our unemployment rate, 6.2%, so 6.17 rounded to one decimal is 6.2%, exactly what we found. And if we click in here, where it said unemployment rate, and in fact if we scroll down, we can look at a number of tables, and one of them is the labor force characteristics by age group and gender. So when we do that, notice here for September 2017, it says that the participation rate is 65.6. That's the labor force participation rate, 65.6. And the unemployment rate, 6.2. And if we compare that to what we found, you'll see our labor force participation rate was 65.6 and our unemployment rate was 6.2. So you can see where that information came from. And if I go back to the Stats Canada website, you can in fact see that information here as well. So the population listed is the working age population, and then you see the labor force, and then you see the number of people who are employed, and it breaks it down by full-time and part-time. And you can also see here the number of people who are unemployed. So you can see where that unemployment rate and labor force participation rate comes from. As part of your activities this week, you're going to be looking at the unemployment rate for the class. So please use the data collected at the beginning of the level, looking at who's working age, part-time and full-time, and looking for work. And from there you can calculate the size of the labor force from the class, and then you can calculate the unemployment rate for the class. So that's part of the activities for this week.